Hello there, everyone, and welcome to this webinar covering off the Sybiz 22 release. And we're going to jump straight into it. We've got a fair bit to cover today, and apologies for clashing with the cricket test. I'm sure some of you have probably got the scores flashing up on your screen, so try and pay attention to me for at least a bit of this. And essentially today what we're going to be covering is just going through the release highlights. We're not going to go into fine-grained detail about a lot of the stuff just because not everything is applicable to everyone, but we'll point you in the right direction to get some more resources if you've not yet discovered things like the What's New page, etc. So we're going to start with Sybiz Vision, then have a look at some of the apps that are now available, and then jump into Sybiz Visipay, and just round out the session with a little bit of an update on the STP2 front as well from a payroll perspective. So that's what we'll be skimming through. And so as far as version 22 is concerned, that was released last week. And I guess the big ticket item there is the bank feeds, and we're going to be spending a little bit of time on that because that is something that is pretty much universally applicable. And there's also been some significant additions to the flexibility in the automatic posting. So we'll talk a little bit about that. And the good news is that if you want to keep doing what you're doing as far as your postings are concerned, none of these changes will impact you. You just keep your setup and configuration as it stands, and everything will still act as it has previously for you. From a bit of a technical viewpoint, this may not mean a lot to a lot of people, but what we have something called the Web API, which allows other programs to interface with the software that is now functionally complete. So that's something that we've been working on over the last couple of years, in addition to the API that's been part of the product since day dot from a Windows perspective. So there's now the web equivalent of that as well. And the apps that we'll be looking at are the sales, purchase, stock and jobs apps. And they've all been updated for version 22, and they're now live on the Apple App Store and the Google Play Store as well. And from a Visipay perspective, it was released a little bit earlier this year, but we'll talk a little bit about timesheets. Again, there's plenty of resources available to go into some more detail on that, so we won't spend a lot of time on that. We'll talk also about the ESS app, which has been revamped as part of those apps that we've published for version 22. And just a little sidebar issue for those that are using the web server and ESS separately in the back end. We've now combined that so that if you are using the app as well as the website from an ESS perspective for Visipay, there is now just a single back end server function there, so makes maintenance and upkeep a lot easier because you're only worrying about one set of services in the background there. So again, probably won't mean much to many people, but it is an improvement that makes life easier. Just a couple of things that are applicable to both products. We now have database server warnings if there's an issue with your database server version or some other little bits and pieces about the database configuration, then you will get a little tooltip float up, and a little warning icon will allow you to hover over that. You get the tooltip, and then you have the ability to click on a hyperlink there, which will take you to a dedicated web page to talk a bit more about what the issues are with your database and what to do about it in conjunction with your IT providers. And we have also separated out what we used to call the options area of the software into a separate company and settings areas. So that just makes it easier to separate the security of things like company bank accounts and things like that. And the other point just to mention as well, both the products are Microsoft Windows 11 ready. So if you are in the market for a new PC or replacing your PC soon, chances are it's going to be coming with Microsoft Windows 11 pre-installed, and the products are all ready to go for that version of Windows. So let's have a bit of a look from a vision perspective firstly. And again, we're going to spend a bit of time on the bank feeds. And essentially what this is all about is it allows you to do a few things. So at a high level, it allows you to match transactions that have already been processed in the cash book to the corresponding transactions when they appear on your bank statement or your bank feed. And it also has the ability to create transactions to represent those that appear on the bank statement. So they first appear on the bank statement. So you're expecting your customer to pay you, but you don't quite know when that's going to occur. And then all of a sudden they pay you. So rather than manually generating a receipt in your cash book, the bank feeds can be configured to create that receipt and do the offset for you with a few preconditions, such as it needs something to match against and associate against to do those things for you. And another example is your bank initiated transactions. So it could be interest received or interest paid, and bank charges and things of that nature, which appear on your bank statement before you put them in the cash book traditionally. And there's still the need to do the bank reconciliation. So there are still some decisions you need to make as part of that process. There may be discrepancies from time to time. Obviously, with things more electronic these days, the chances of things being out of whack are a lot less than they were back in the old days of things being manually processed. But there's still that necessity to go through that bank reconciliation process. It is automated by virtue of using bank feeds. What happens is any transaction that's processed via bank feeds will be flagged automatically as reconciled for when you go into the bank reconciliation. And there's some intelligence built into the system as well, such that if you have done your bank feeds beyond the date in which you want to do the bank reconciliation, then if you untick those transactions that are after the date of your bank rec, then once you process that bank rec, those transactions will be reinstated as reconciled for next time. So some pretty good automation there with the bank rec. And just as a bit of a side note, we are utilising a third-party service from a company called InvestNet, and the service is called Yodlee. It is widely used out there, one of the most popular on the planet. And that service is used to communicate with the bank. So it's not Sybiz communicating with the bank. So we don't hold on to any of your banking credentials, etc. That's all powered by Yodlee, who've been authorised by the banks to fetch that information on your behalf. Obviously, with your blessing, you need to give them the credentials to utilise for that service. So just letting you know a little bit about the background there. And there are privacy policies and terms and conditions, etc., that you can look into as part of the process as well. And just taking you through a process overview, there's a bit of setup to do just to get started. And so I'm just going to walk you through that just on a screen capture viewpoint. So you start your journey by going into bank feed defaults, tell the system that you want to actually enable the bank feeds in the first place. And then you need to configure your bank accounts, your bank feed accounts. And once you click on that button, you are then presented with basically the most popular banks front and center. But these are, I guess, most popular on the basis of not so much the businesses in exclusivity, it's businesses and personal. So they're ranked according to personal use as well. So it may be like with Commonwealth, for example, they have CommBiz, which is their business bank side of things, or their business bank portal. So that's not there with those tiles that you can see. So you can then search, start typing in, and it'll start finding the other combinations of banks associated with the Commonwealth Bank in this example here. So you can then select CommBiz. Once you've done that, it'll take you through to another web page. I did mention about the terms of use. You can see the link there, so you can see what these terms of use are, and satisfy yourself that it is a service that you're wanting to use. You provide your normal banking details, so whatever you use to log into the websites ordinarily. Apologies if you're exclusively using the apps these days. You probably don't remember your login IDs and passwords, but you will need those to initiate the bank feed process. And it is something where not every single bank under the sun has been, we don't have details as to what all the requirements are for each individual bank. So you may need to talk to your bank. You may need to get some extra security features disabled temporarily to enable this connection to be established. So just if you do run into a spot of bother, just check with your bank to see what the requirements are to connect via a third-party service. And so once you've done that, you then get listed you'll get a list of the bank accounts associated with your login, and you then get to tick and flick which ones you want to include in the bank feed process, because there may be banks that you don't want to worry about doing the bank feed process in your software, so you just don't select those if you don't want them, or there may be banks associated with other companies within your group, so you only want to select the banks associated with the company database that you're in. And once you've done that, they will then come through into the bank feed account list, and then you select those from the list. You will notice the redaction there. I'll talk more about that in a moment with those X's. Yeah, so essentially what you're wanting to do here is associate your cash book bank accounts or your general ledger bank accounts with the corresponding bank account from the bank feed side of the fence. So you can have multiple different banks associated with your database. So it's not like you can only use one bank, you can use multiple different banks, but they must be either Australian or New Zealand banks at this point in time. So it's only Australia and New Zealand that is supported. And that's essentially the end of the setup process. So once you've done that, that's all you need. That's a kind of one-off thing, unless there's something like a change in your banking credentials, or you want to add a new bank account or something along those lines, or you change bank accounts. Of course, you're going to need to go back and repeat that process to enable those links to occur. And the next few steps that we'll go through talk about the ongoing process. So once you go into the bank feed screen itself, you'll get a list of the transactions that have been fed through that haven't been dealt with previously. And I'll talk more about the rules in just a moment, but just as a high-level overview of your ongoing process, once your rules have been established, you just click on Update Lines and then run the rules on the empty lines. And what happens there is it'll go through, run the rules, and do the best it can in terms of creating and matching transactions. And there's generally always going to be exceptions where perhaps, say, a customer hasn't used the reference number that you wanted them to use, and so it can't identify who that transaction should be associated to. It can also, depending on how you have things like codes configured, it may sometimes think that a rule has applies to a different customer or something like that. And so there is an example here where it's associated the wrong transaction to the wrong customer, because two customers with a similar code have got the same amount transaction outstanding. So just a word of warning that it is a process that you don't just sort of blindly go through, and especially when you start and you're establishing the rules within the system, don't just blindly go through and accept everything that the bank feeds process does. And also make a peace with the fact that it's not a case of wanting to automate absolutely everything and match and create transactions 100% of the time. So if a rule doesn't create a transaction, it will sort of just be in its original state, and then you can just deal with that transaction manually. But once everything's established, and perhaps your customers need a bit of retraining to use references, etc., when they do an EFT to you, then you should get the majority of your transactions dealt with via the rules. So once the rules have been applied, then you just and you deal with your transactions that haven't been matched or created. Then you go back to Update Lines and approve all rule match lines. So again, the reason we put you through this separate process is, again, we don't want you to be on autopilot and just accept that the system has done everything that you expect it to do. Sometimes a match rule might be ambiguous, and so it might find the incorrect transaction based on the way you have your rules configured, because these are rules that you have the power to configure those as well. And so by having this separate step here of approving, that means that you've scanned down the page, you've had a look to make sure that it is as you expect it to be. And once you're okay with that, then you approve all the rule match lines, and then you can just go through and process. And so what that will do once you process is, from a match transaction point of view, that's pretty easy. All that does is flags them as reconciled because they already exist in your cash book, and you're just associating them with the corresponding transaction from the bank side of the fence. With the created transactions, what they will do is they will go through and create the cash book receipts and payments, and also do the offsetting in some cases as well, where the offsetting is able to do what's required. Sometimes you will get a situation where the transaction will be created, but the offset may need to be handled manually because there's not enough information in the system to know what you want to do from an offset point of view. So yeah, essentially all of those things happen as a result of doing the bank feed transactions. And just for completeness as well, the transactions that are created will also be flagged as reconciled for when you go into bank rec. So a little bit more about the rules. We have the match rules and the create rules. And so the match rules, as I said earlier, is these transactions already exist in the cash book. You've processed them, so it could be payments that you've made to your suppliers. So you've processed those payments in the cash book because you've generated the EFT file. Yeah, so what we're doing with the match rule is essentially just saying, okay, now that payment batch has appeared on the bank statement, we want to associate the cash book transaction with the bank fee transaction and reconcile those. So we do have 8 match rules out of the box. It's essentially 2 pairs of 4 rules, with one has strict, it must be on this same date as it's processed in the cash book, and the other pair of 4 rules has a 3-day either side tolerance. So we don't recommend you switch them all on blindly. Just choose the ones that are appropriate to you. And again, as you're starting to learn to use the system, just take extra care and make sure it's doing what you're wanting it to do in those early days. And the create rules, these are ones that are totally within your control to create them. So there are none that ship with the software. You create those yourself based on what's right for your organization. So there's decisions you need to make, like if you've instructed your customers when they do a direct deposit into your bank account to use their customer code, for example, then you will create rules that will be based on customer code. Alternatively, if you've asked your customers to use the sales invoice number when they make a payment, then you'll create rules based on the reference of the outstanding transactions, and because that's what you're matching at the end of, or creating at the end of the day, is you're creating a receipt transaction based on a customer paying an invoice, if indeed that's what they're doing. Or they could, as I said, just be using their customer code because they're making a payment against their account and not necessarily against specific invoices. So when you create your create rules, you have the ability to create them per individual bank, or you can create them to be applied to all banks. So you've got some choice there. So you could have different types of rules for different banks depending on the nature of your organization. So just a few best practice hints. If you are using numeric customer codes or even partial numeric customer codes, use a uniform length. That just helps the matching process to occur, because if you had a customer with a code of 1 and another one with 1, 2, 3, 4, then it's possible the customer code 1 will be matched rather than the 1, 2, 3, 4 if a reference of 1, 2, 3, 4 is used. In the Yodlee service, now this is very important, but just to explain it a little bit, that because of various privacy legislation around the world, the Yodlee service, it doesn't necessarily know whether a number is representative of a bank account number or a credit card number or some other sort of sensitive number. So what that does out of the box is it redacts any digits beyond 4. So it starts at the right, and if it sees a string of more than 4 digits in a row, numerical digits in a row, it will X out the additional digits, as you can see in that example there, where the reference there is a sales invoice reference, and it normally has 6 digits. So in your system, you've processed it, it's had a reference with 6 digits, but the Yodlee system will redact those first 2 digits in that 6 digit string there. So the software, the bank feed process, is intelligent enough to deal with that. And if you think about it from a sales invoice number perspective, you'd need essentially 10,000 invoices to clock around that last 4 digits. So it's not something that should cause too much concern in terms of the likelihood of having sales invoices outstanding with a gap of 10,000 digits between them is fairly unlikely in most scenarios. So as I mentioned previously, you should train your customers to use the references that suit you. So again, if they're paying you a one-to-one payment for an invoice, then you'd want them to use the invoice number. If they're making a payment against their account, there could be multiple invoices, and you want to use, say, automatic offsets, then you'd want them to use their customer code, because that's what you're going to be attributing those receipts to. A few more hints as well is that certain transactions will appear on the bank statement as a group of transactions. So when you do, say, a EFT batch, you'll get, it could be, you've got 10 payments to your creditors in that EFT batch, but rather than show each individual payment on your bank statement, the bank will consolidate that in some cases to just a single line. Yeah, so you want to ensure that you use a group reference in those scenarios, because that's what you're going to be matching against what the bank has put on the bank statement for you. So also consider using automatic payments if you're not already doing that, and that supports group references. So again, that just makes that process a bit easier. As I mentioned before, don't try and create rules for every conceivable scenario. Make your peace with the fact that there are going to be some transactions that are just one-offs or happen very rarely, or just it doesn't make sense to create a rule for them, because you're going to be spending more time creating a rule than actually handling these odd transactions once in a blue moon. So that's a good word of warning there. And the service itself is at the mercy of a few links in the chain, in terms of sometimes the banks become unavailable, and it may be that you can actually log into your online banking website, but just for whatever reason the bank's not available through the Yodi service temporarily. So that will happen from time to time, and you can either try again later, or if it's important that you get those transactions into your cash book ASAP, and you don't want to wait any longer, you can handle those transactions manually. So on that basis, when the bank feed service becomes available again, you will get transactions that perhaps you've manually processed through your cash book, and you can essentially ignore those via a right click and ignore process. And when you process your bank feeds, those ones will just be disassociated from a link back to your bank feeds, because you've done them manually off the bank statement already. You'd most likely, when you process it in the cash book, you would have flagged them as presented, because you are using the bank statement manually for that process. So hopefully that makes sense. And also there is rule prioritization, and the idea there is that you try and get your more precise rules, the ones that are configured to match very specific transactions. You want to get them to run before your broader rules, because the more precise rules, or the more things that can be created or matched via precise rules, that means they're not going to lead to any ambiguity when your broader rules are firing later in the sequence. And just from a common sense point of view, there is some intelligence in the system to make sure that people aren't doing a bank rec and bank feeds at the same time, because they're essentially both related to the bank rec, and you don't want to be playing tug of war with someone else who's doing a bank rec at the same time you're doing bank feeds. So you will get a message if you try and do one when someone is doing the other. And it's not essential, but we do recommend, again, best practice, that when you are planning to do a bank rec and you're doing bank feeds as well, only do your bank feeds up to the date in which your bank rec will be performed. It just makes it a little bit easier, because then you don't have to uncheck things in the bank rec process, yeah, just get your bank rec finalized before going back to the bank feeds. So I'll talk a little bit more about some resources that we've got available for you in a moment, because it applies to all of these changes. But so on to the next thing is the automatic postings enhancements. And we have a little bit to talk about there, but we did some changes in version 20 in the inventory module to allow you to do this, but it's now been extended through to jobs and service for consistency. So traditionally, even with Sybiz Vision Classic, that was built around the periodic method of automatic postings. And so if you're happily using that method, then you don't need to change anything. It'll just continue posting as it always has, so you don't have to worry about any of this. But for those that may want to use this new process, it essentially drives what's called the matching posting method, and essentially the I guess the summarized version of what that's all about is that nothing really hits your P&L until the time that the sales invoice is processed. So that's the idea is, or the idea of the matching is that it matches the revenue and costs in the same period as which the sale occurs. So there are some exceptions there, pre-invoices and estimate-based invoices. So because they're essentially using pseudo costs, you lose that connection between the actual costs and the costs associated with those jobs, and in that regard, there's not much we can do about that. So the costs will hit the P&L at the time the pseudo costs are journaled toward the end of the job. And if you want to change to this method, it is relatively easy, but it may require changes to your internal accounting policies and some journals. So definitely involve your external accountants in that process. So where I say it's easy, it's just a matter of putting in the additional posting accounts into the system for, say, your job groups and service groups, etc. And just a word of advice as well, there is a change in nature of accounts if you are using this particular method, where the labour accrual accounts will essentially become clearing accounts. So they will continue to accumulate until you manually journal out of them, just like any other clearing account. So but that is a change in nature of that specific account, or those specific accounts, because there are now multiple labour accruals across the ledgers. So that is the automatic postings enhancements. Hopefully this is animating for you. This has just been ripped straight off of our What's New page, which I'll talk about a little bit later. So it's just some of the other enhancements that are in Vision 22 is we have more information now on locations. So more sort of qualitative information can be stored against the locations, which can then be put on your transaction documents, etc. So that's one change there. Email signatures have been added, so you have the ability to apply these to your various templates, and you'll see the little checkbox there to add the signature, and that just gives you, I guess, a more professional looking email out of the box when you go and process your transactions, etc. There's now a facility to copy lines from other transactions. So we've had the new from in there for quite some time, but the copy lines from, in most cases, the new from will do the job for you, but it may well be that you're wanting to sort of combine two orders that have occurred previously. And with the new from, you can only do a single transaction via new from. But the ability to copy lines will allow you to bring in the lines from one or many additional transactions into a new transaction that you're doing, and you have the ability to choose different types of transactions. So you can bring, say, the lines from a standalone sales credit into a sales invoice, for example. There has been a change also to manufacturing, and this is just something just to talk about for those that are using manufacturing. Apologies to those that aren't, because this probably won't make too much sense, but essentially there are multiple options within the configuration of your assemblies, and if you do have assemblies that are set to manufacture on delivery, so some of you may prefer to regard those as kits, but if they are flagged to not be exploitable upon return, what was happening previously is that when you do a sales return, it would always break the assembly down into its lowest level components. So if someone returned a bike, it would pull that bike apart into the various components, which is perhaps not what you want to have occur. So the new behavior, you've got more control over this now. So if you have it set to not exploitable upon return, then that assembly will be returned to stock as a finished good. Alternatively, if you do want it broken down, then you do need to make sure that you have it flagged to be explodable upon return. So again, apologies for those that aren't using manufacturing, that will make not too much sense. So some of the other enhancements, I won't talk about all of these, just again, these are all available on the What's New page. So you've got the ability to go into the product inquiry from stock take. You have now separate sales price precision on the sales and purchase side of things. The purchase templates now support jobs and service. You can suspend preferred suppliers, so it may be they have issues in getting stock to you, and so you can say, okay, well, I just want to suspend that preferred supplier for X period of time until those issues are sorted out. There's a few enhancements in the purchase requisition area, so you now have the ability to select an approval group for a particular purchase requisition to go through. There's some changes to CRM as well, the ability to close, reopen leads and opportunities that have been closed previously. There's now company level custom fields, so again, that's one of the reasons why we split out that old options area as well. And there's a whole heap of reporting improvements, including a new purchase price variance report. So that's just a few of those. Again, there's more information on the What's New page. Just talking quickly about the apps that have, again, been all refreshed for version 22. And just as a little bit of background, I've talked previously about the web API. So that is a module that is required to power these apps, and that needs to be configured appropriately, etc. So once you have the web API, these apps are available to you for the various functions within the software. So from a job perspective, essentially the workflow is that the jobs are created in the back office, and once they're created, then you have the ability to deal with them via the app. So do things like apply costs to the job, times, get map information, schedule appointments, spit out transaction documents, all integrating back into your back office database with offline ability as well. So if you are temporarily offline, you can still transact, and once you're online again, it will sync the data back into the back office database. The stock app allows you to do stock takes and sales picks. So you again create the stock take in the back office, and you allocate that to the user that you want to perform the stock take. They can then pull that up on their device and go through and count the stock. There's things like the barcode scanning and the ability to find codes, etc. And they can process that through. And this is all live, so as long as you're not offline, once you process the stock take on the device, it will process the stock take in the back office system as well. From a sales pick point of view, similar sort of process. Those picks are created and allocated to the person that you want to do the picking, and they go through and do the relevant picking and process that through. The sales app allows you to do quotes and orders. So a little bit different to the other two apps in that you have the ability to create quotes and orders on your device, as well as interact with quotes and orders that have been previously created. And other than that, it's all pretty similar in terms of once you process them, etc., that updates your back office database as well. And the flip side, from a purchase point of view, we have the purchase requisitions and purchase orders. Again, very similar. You can create and interact with ones that have already been created as well, and all of that on your smart devices. So again, just previously the apps that we've done were purely for iOS, but now they're for Android as well. So they are available on both of those platforms. From a resources point of view, we have the What's New for both Vision and Visipay. So you can get to those links. Generally, what happens from a Vision perspective is when you install the upgrade, the What's New page becomes one of the docked panels within the system. It'll be front and center for you just to sort of scan down there and see what is new and get to some other resources in terms of YouTube clips for the meteor items and the animated GIFs that provide some additional information as well. And also from the the what's new, there'll be various links and important information about some of the changes that need to be sort of highlighted. You'll see it's a little bit hard to read, but we talk about the manufacture on delivery, explodable upon return, etc. Just giving you a heads up on those kind of things. And there is also on our corporate page, you can go and have a look at some information about the upgrade process and what you need to consider before upgrading, etc. as well. If you have made your What's New page disappear and you want to get back to it, you can do so by clicking the top left menu, the top left button in the applications, and then going to Help and then What's New. And that's the way that you need to do it in Visipay, because we don't have that concept of the docked panels within Visipay at this point in time. So yeah, so please make use of that What's New. You can jump back and forth to the previous versions, etc. And a word of advice that the Sybiz Vision Classic program, that is going into end of support as at the end of this month. So what that means is Sybiz will not provide support to business partners, and that's just because as we have new staff come on board, it just makes no sense to train them up on the Classic product with so few customers still using that product. So your business partners, they can decide what to do. If they want to continue to support it, they can, but they do so in the knowledge that Sybiz won't support them in supporting you. And I should just make the distinction as well that this doesn't mean end of life for Sybiz Vision Classic. We'll give you plenty of warning as to when that will occur. Obviously, for those customers that have upgraded, there's still some historical information in the Classic database that they want to gain access to from time to time. So we know, obviously, we're going to need to keep the Classic program alive in some sense for some time yet. So we'll continue to unlock the program, but it should be pretty well established now that we're only doing that for version 12 and above from next year. So anyone on earlier versions, we won't be able to unlock that program. Essentially, any version earlier than 12 is over 10 years old as of next year. So I think that should be all I need to say on that topic there. And just on to Visipay, we are running a little bit behind time. So if people are here just for Vision, we unfortunately run out of time to take questions. So if you do want to go about your day, please do so. But for those who want a bit of information about Visipay and or STP2, stay tuned and we'll fly through these next few slides here. So from an enhancement point of view, there's been a few things, not just in the general release, but in recent releases as well. So we introduced timesheet entry, I believe that was around August, and we've also updated the ESS app, which I'll talk about as well. You have the ability now to purge archived payslips. So that's purely sort of to reduce the size of your database, and the payslips can be regenerated if required down the track. But what we recommend is that you retain a backup with the archive payslips in them. And it's good practice as well to maintain a backup from each financial year long term as well. So those payslips will always be available in their original form. When you regenerate a payslip, if it's not in archive, it doesn't have, it will reflect the current information with respect to things like leave accruals, etc. But obviously the pay items themselves and tax calculations will be as they were at the time the payslip was created. Just on that as well, we're not archiving, or sorry, we're not purging the payment summary archive. The reason for that is the format from time to time changes, and we only generate against the current format in the version that you're running. So that means that we won't necessarily be able to regenerate in the format that was relevant in the year in which the payment summary was created. We have now introduced the ability to modify the leave management email template. So when you do leave requests, you've got more control over what those emails say, so you can provide some more information if required. And a few other little bits and pieces as well. Salary sacrifice is now applicable on allowances. The ESS app supports the part days of leave. So if you're just getting, say, 0.8 of a day, you can now do that. The leave calendar, the color scheme is now coordinated across both the desktop application and the ESS website, just to make it look a bit more consistent there. And we've also added some more smarts into the STP process to reduce the likelihood of there being a duplicate submission sent. Sometimes people are on autopilot and they'll send it a couple times when they have forgotten that they've already sent it. So there's some intelligence built in to restrict that from occurring. So just a little bit on the timesheets. It's available in the desktop application and the ESS website. So not the app at this point in time. So just making that distinction there. And it's really sort of pitched at those employees that work variable hours, but it can be used in various other applications as well. And you do have flexible entry modes. You can enter on the basis of just the quantity of hours or a specific time to and from. You can enter breaks explicitly or just by a quantity as well, and a few other little bits and pieces as far as the flexibility is concerned there. And you have various controls that you can implement as well. So you can have timesheet cutoff dates. So unless the timesheets are received by a certain point in time, then that means that those timesheets won't be included in the current pay run. There's, of course, approval and rejection processes as part of the whole timesheet service as well. So again, there's some additional resources there you'll be able to get to on our YouTube channel, the What's New pages, etc., on the timesheets. From the ESS app point of view, essentially that has been totally revamped recently, and you have the ability to put through leave requests, check your leave balances, fetch pay slips, approve leave if you're in the approval role. And again, this is communicating directly with your database, and yeah, it's an app that's available on both the iOS and Android platforms as well. So just a couple need to know things from a Visipay perspective as well, just while we have you. The budget this year announced that they'll be doing away with the $4.50 monthly minimum, but that hasn't happened yet. We're keeping an eye on the passage of legislation, but as far as the latest update's concerned, it hasn't actually hit Parliament yet. But the idea is that will be disappearing. But we have made a modification in the software. Previously, we were only applying that to employees that were in a casual award. That now no longer applies. It will do the $4.50 irrespective of the nature of employment. So that could be someone that's paid reasonably well and they return on the last day of month from, say, paternity leave, and they only work one day in that month, they're below the $4.50. And if you've got them associated with the staff type, that will exclude super for those earning less than $4.50, then they won't get super for that last day of the month that they work. The quarterly super threshold, we have changed that as well, where it's incompatible, or rather I should just say it's incompatible with fixed superannuation amounts. It doesn't make sense, but we have had a couple instances of people configuring their software in that way and getting some weird results. So just a word of warning there, not to use the quarterly super thresholds with fixed superannuation. And because it's now no longer required for the Super Choice Sybiz Super service, we have got rid of versions 1 and 2 of the Sybiz Super export, just to make it easier, so people are exporting the correct version for Sybiz Super. And just rounding out our 45 minutes, apologies, we're going to go a couple minutes over, but yeah, essentially just talking about STP Phase 2 or STP2, and just a few things on that. So I think when we had our end of financial year webinar, we did mention that we were going to be applying for a deferral for STP2. It's not something we normally do. We're normally on the front foot with these kind of things, so it's not a decision we take lightly. I've been with the company over 20 years and I can't recall a single time that we've applied for a deferral. So it is something that we've done so based on a very thorough decision-making process. And essentially, we are now seeing some advice coming out of the ATO as to what to do if you transition to STP2 partway through a year, and it's an absolute nightmare for employers. The options that they have, it's just ridiculous, and that's, I guess, one small reason why we wanted to get away from a 1 January start date, because it just is stupid to make such a change partway through a financial year. And essentially you coattail our deferral. So because when you send your STP reports that has your ABN as part of the file, the ATO knows that you're associated with us, because you're also sending a product ID through the process as well. And so you're cool by association in terms of you have a deferral based on our deferral. But if you do need longer, and you probably can't make a decision on that just at this point in time, but let's just say in a few months' time, once STP2 becomes a bit more real for you, it may be that you want to extend your deferral beyond the 1st of July 2022, and that's something that you can apply for on your own basis with the ATO. And I believe there's some information available on their website, but at the moment you probably wouldn't be able to get that deferral through based on the fact that we're still 6 months away from having the software available for you. And initially the ATO came out of the box and basically said, oh, STP2, nothing to see here, not much is changing. And that miffed us a bit as software developers, because there is quite a bit to consider. So, and just on that point, the ATO has recently conducted a series of 5 webinars. I think the total time was around 6.5, 7 hours, explaining the changes. And these webinars were aimed at businesses. If you didn't actually attend those webinars, a word of warning, they could be a little bit intimidating, because they do cover off some fairly complex changes. Not all of the changes are relevant to every organisation, but I'll talk a little bit more about those on the next slide. But those webinars are available if you go to a search engine and type in ATO space STP2. That'll give you the link to the STP2 resources on the ATO website, and there's a link for events and presentations. You can click on that and watch the recordings of those webinars. So we were initially intending to have some front-end changes for STP in version 22, but we just decided against that at this point in time. So there will be another release early in 2022 to get you ready for your reporting prior to 1st of July 2022. Yeah, just talking about what's changing and what's not changing. So I guess the ATO were right in terms of the core reporting process is not changing. So what you do in terms of going through processing your pays, checking your pays, and then going through and doing your ATO transfer, that process isn't going to change at all. But what is going to change is the nature of what's being reported. And apologies for the ATO lingo, but just so if you do want to drill into this a little bit more, this will allow you to find those corresponding resources on the ATO website. And so a couple of things that are changing is that there's this concept of the disaggregation of gross. And what that is all about is previously what we've done is we've just reported the gross income as a single line. And now there's various components that the ATO want you to break that down into. And that's not going to be too much of a challenge. You may need to create some new pay items to support that process, and we'll have heaps of resources to guide you through that. But where it does get a little bit confusing and will be more onerous on employers is with things like salary sacrifice. So for, I guess, your normal salary sacrifice to super, it's not going to be too much of a difference for you. But when you're salary sacrificing, say on a fringe benefits basis, that's been previously reportable. So again, that's not going to change too much, but there are other elements of salary sacrifice, such as to exempt benefits that previously you didn't have to report the exempt benefits. So the ATO didn't really know that those kind of benefits were being paid, but what they're wanting to essentially achieve at the end of the day is they're wanting to gross your salary or gross your earnings back up to the pre-salary sacrifice amounts, So that's a significant change from a salary sacrifice point of view in STP2, because previously you'd be showing your earnings net of the salary sacrifice. Now we're going to be showing pre-sacrifice earnings. And another tricky area is annualized salaries and overtime. It's that combination that's caused a little bit of confusion, but there's some more clarification around that now. So apologies for those that it doesn't apply to, but it's the scenario where someone's working, say, the typical example is a manager in a supermarket where their working hours that if they were a casual would ordinarily be overtime, but there's just a guesstimate where their salary is packaged up on the basis of there being a portion of their working hours that would be considered overtime. And overtime is something that needs to be separately reported. So that's going to be, a little bit onerous for employers that are in that category to report things in the correct bucket. And if you are in that category, I strongly encourage you to watch the corresponding ATO webinar on that. I think it might have been the 4th in the series. Apologies if I'm wrong on that, but it is something where you need to be very aware of what you're going to need to do going forward. The employment and taxation conditions are needing to be reportable. So what the ATO want to do there is get you to report the nature of the employment, which is essentially the whether your employees are part-time, full-time, casual, etc., and the taxation conditions. So this is a little bit more complex than just associating a tax scale with an employee. You essentially need to tell the ATO the basis on which you're taxing the employee so that they can do their own checks and balances to make sure that you are doing the correct withholding based on the nature of the employment of that individual. And that also feeds through into the tax file number declaration, which eventually STP2 will take the place of the TFN declaration. Income types is another thing that needs to be more obviously reportable. So that's not so much of an issue. That's things like salary and wages, which the majority of employees will be under, but it does take into consideration things like working holiday makers as well. Country codes are going to need a bit more structure. So if you do have people with foreign addresses or working holiday makers, etc., then there's more structure around the data required. Another, I guess this is probably the driver of a lot more stricter reporting, is the child support garnishee and deductions reporting through STP2 as well. And there's also support for previous IDs. So one of the bugbears of the ATO in the design of the original STP is that if someone changed their employee number within the software, the ATO would treat them as a separate person, and it might be a bit confusing when people go and do their tax returns. Similarly, if you change the Visipay partway through the financial year, that also created a bit of concern in the ATO sort of matching things up at their end. So there's some facilities there for those previous IDs. Based on the guidance that Sybiz has given and some of the restrictions that have been put in the software, that's not really applicable to us, but just letting you know that that's one of the key changes in STP2. So hopefully that doesn't sort of frighten too many people, but there will be a bit of work. I guess that's the thing that we really want to emphasize, is that somewhere between when we release the next version of the software and the start of the new financial year, you are going to need to be doing a bit of homework. You might need to learn to unlearn, as Yoda would say, in terms of some of the things that you've perhaps got away with in the past because we weren't putting through such fine-grained reporting through to the ATO. So there may be some things that you've accepted as the right thing to do over all these years, and from an ATO reporting point of view, that hasn't made a difference because we don't report that historically. But going forward, you may need to just get some more structures and processes in place. And again, we'll have plenty of guidance there to help you with that. But it is something where you may need to be having a bit of a chat to the ATO and your accountants and advisors as well, just to make sure that you do have things set correctly going forward. So with that, again, apologies for going a little bit over time there. that is all we have time for. Unfortunately, we don't have any time for questions, but if you do want some questions answered, just we have the contact form on our website. That's the best way to put them through. And I think we've managed to cover off a few of the questions that came through the registration process as well. And we may have had some questions answered by some people in the background as we've been going along as well. But if you do have questions that have remained unanswered, just send them through our web contact form. And that's something you can do if you're watching the recording as well. And we'll get back to you with an answer, and perhaps in some cases direct you to your business partners or advisors where appropriate as well. So with that, I guess, yeah, this time last year we were thinking we might be all the way through the pandemic in the not too distant future. So let's hope that that's the case this year, and wish you all the best for a fabulous 2022 and all the best for the festive season as well. And we'll talk to you soon. Thank you. Bye.